The Xenobiology lab on the Persephone was a cathedral of light and logic. Everything was white, silver, and perfectly sanitized. High Exarch Kalen stood at the center of his Shadow-Fang unit, his iridescent blue-green skin shimmering under the soft, UV-balanced ceiling panels. They were the pinnacle of evolution, fast, lean, and equipped with neural-linked plasma carbines that could track a target through a foot of lead. Across the room, behind 3 layers of reinforced transparent aluminum, Subject Zero paced. It was a mass of gray, corded muscle and multifaceted eyes, a biological mistake that the Solari Empire had spent billions to create. Then, the logic failed. A microscopic structural flaw in the main coolant line, perhaps a gift from a tired human welder, decided to give way. The explosion was small, but it was enough. A jagged piece of the pipe shattered the containment field generator. The facility's AI didn't hesitate. It didn't care about the elite commandos or the billion-credit experiment. It only cared about the colony ship attached to the lab. Extreme Contamination Protocol initiated. The AI's voice chimed, sounding entirely too polite. Atmospheric venting in T-5 seconds. Please secure all breathing apparatus. Kalen's large, efficient eyes widened. The Shadow-Fangs didn't carry breathing apparatus. Their combat suits were designed for the nitrogen-rich atmospheres of the core worlds, relying on high-tech filters, not independent oxygen supplies. In the auxiliary observation booth, Leroy Jenkins stopped eating his sandwich. He was a void jumper, a man whose job was to climb into the jagged, airless guts of dead ships to recover salvage. He was broad, scarred, and looked like a piece of industrial equipment that had been left out in the rain. Leroy looked at Kalen through the glass. He didn't panic. He reached for a heavy, compressed air harpoon gun sitting on a tool rack. "Wait," Kalen shouted, his voice cracking as the pressure began to drop. There was no sound to follow his plea. The emergency seals blew. The air didn't just leave, it vanished. The roar of the decompression lasted only a split second before the silence of the void claimed the room. Every loose object, datapads, chairs, loose pens, was sucked into the dark recycling vents. Then, the silence became absolute. Kalen felt his lungs start to burn. His species was built for efficiency, for high-energy combat, but they were delicate. Without pressure, their internal chemistry began to unravel instantly. A timer appeared on his wristcom, 60 seconds until critical system failure. Through the reinforced glass of the booth, he saw the human. Leroy wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing his work vest and cargo pants. He took one long, deep, steady breath, closed his mouth, and slammed the manual override for the booth door. The human stepped into the vacuum. The silence of a vacuum is not a true silence. It is a symphony of internal failure. Kalen's ears didn't ring. They throbbed with the sound of his own blood screaming against his eardrums. The nitrogen in his veins began to form microscopic bubbles, a localized, agonizing version of the bends that turned every joint into a grinding hinge of glass. He looked at his team, the elite Shadow-Fangs. They were falling, not to Subject Zero, but to the physics of the void. One commando gripped his throat, his iridescent skin turning a sickly, bruised purple as his capillaries shattered. Another collapsed, his large eyes clouding over as the moisture on his retinas boiled away into the thin, frozen air. T-45 seconds. Kalen fell to one knee. He tried to raise his plasma carbine, but his fingers were numb, the fine motor control required for the neural link lost to the swelling of his tissues. Then, he saw the human. Leroy Jenkins was moving through the debris-cluttered lab with a terrifying, rhythmic deliberation. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wasn't wearing a mask. He was just a man in a thermal vest, his jaw clamped shut so tightly the muscles in his neck stood out like iron cables. Kalen's HUD flickered, showing the human's vitals through the observation link. Species: human Terran status. Vacuum exposure, estimated consciousness, 90 to 120 seconds. Heart rate, 180 BPM adrenaline spike. Kalen's mind, clouded by hypoxia, couldn't fathom it. The Silari were the masters of the stars, yet their bodies were built for the comfort of the atmosphere. Humans were built on a planet with tectonic shifts, predatory megafauna, and a gravity that demanded bone density the rest of the galaxy found barbaric. They were persistence hunters. They didn't need to be faster, they just needed to be the last thing standing. Leroy reached a wall and kicked off, his magnetic work boots clinking softly against a structural beam. He didn't swim through the air like a panicked animal. He used the 0G as a shortcut. He was a void jumper. He had spent decades in the red zone, that thin, lethal sliver of time between the last breath and the final blackout. T-minus 20 seconds. Subject Zero emerged from the shadows of the cooling vents. It didn't need air. It was a biological tank designed for planetary siege. It saw the dying aliens as easy meat, its gray, corded muscles rippling as it prepared to pounce on the paralyzed Kalen. Leroy saw it too. The human didn't scream. He couldn't. He just adjusted his grip on the compressed air harpoon, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of crimson as the pressure differential pushed his biology to the absolute limit. He wasn't a hero in a shiny suit. He was a man holding his breath in a room that wanted him dead. He entered the red zone, the point where the brain begins to starve, but the sheer, stubborn will of the species refuses to let go. The silence of the void was a gift. For Sergeant L. Jenkins, the vacuum didn't feel like a death sentence. It felt like a quiet, structured environment. In a high-speed firefight, everything was chaos. But here, everything was math. Gravity was gone. Sound was gone. The only variables that mattered were mass, velocity, and the precise rhythm of the 700 cc's of atmosphere still trapped in his lungs. He didn't move across the lab. He navigated. His work vest was heavy with tools, but in 0G, weight was meaningless. Inertia was everything. He kicked off the corner of the auxiliary observation booth, his magnetic boots clinking softly against a structural beam, setting himself on a perfect diagonal intercept path toward the center of the room. His body was in agony, the red zone of hypoxia pushing his perception. His skin was flushing deep purple. His vision was tunneling, the edges of the lab fading into a blurry gray vignette. His jaw was locked tight, a silent vow that the oxygen would not escape. He didn't use his eyes to find the monster. They were practically useless now. He used his feel. Subject Zero was huge. As it uncoiled from the shadows of the vent, its bulk displaced the microscopic residue of frozen vapor floating in the air. Leroy saw the slight, almost invisible tremor in the structure of the lab. He felt the phantom vibration through the metal pipe he was currently gripping. The monster lunged toward High Exarch Kalen. Leroy didn't adjust his path. He let inertia carry him. He crossed the lab, a silent, blunt force of nature moving through the whiteout. He dropped onto Subject Zero's back. He didn't brace. He simply allowed the mass of his own body to slam into the creature. He didn't have to worry about the monster hearing him. It only felt a sudden, massive, kinetic weight anchoring it to the spot. Subject Zero thrashed, its gray, corded muscles rippling. It tried to reach back with its secondary limbs, but Leroy was already in position. He planted his heavy work boots into the small of the beast's back, leveraging every ounce of his stubborn human muscle. He didn't have time for a tactical assessment. His internal clock was screaming, 40 seconds to total shutdown. He raised the compact, industrial harpoon gun. He didn't aim for the chest. He didn't aim for the heart. He aimed for the single point where the creature's decentralized nervous system converged, the base of the thick, segmented tail. The sound was internal, a vibration that traveled from the stock of the harpoon into the marrow of Leroy's bones. The compressed air released with a silent burst of pressure. The solid titanium spike, 6 inches long and razor-sharp, was driven through the chitinous armor plates and into Subject Zero's primary neural node. The monster froze. Its multifaceted eyes didn't shut. They just went dark. It didn't scream. Its entire body simply arched, rigid and paralyzed, and then went entirely, beautifully limp. Subject Zero drifted in the zero gravity, its mass anchored only by the human still gripping its back, holding his last breath in a room that was suddenly perfectly safe. The world was a blur of static and crimson. Kalen felt the edges of his consciousness fraying, his heart struggling to push thickened, oxygen-starved blood through his narrowing vessels. His internal timer hit 03. He closed his large eyes, waiting for the final, silent dark. Then, the flaw hit him. It wasn't a soft landing. It was the sudden, brutal return of 1G artificial gravity. A thunderous, mechanical clunk echoed through the deck plates as the backup generators kicked in. The sound was the most beautiful thing Kalen had ever heard, the high-pitched, screaming roar of atmospheric repressurization. Nitrogen and oxygen flooded back into the room, swirling the white chemical smoke and the drifting droplets of Subject Zero's black blood into a chaotic cyclone. Kalen's lungs spasmed, drawing in the first freezing gulp of air. He coughed violently, his iridescent skin burning as the pressure stabilized. He rolled onto his side, gasping, his vision slowly clearing from gray to white. A few feet away, the massive, armored corpse of Subject Zero lay slumped like a fallen mountain of gray meat, and sitting against its ribcage, clutching a bent harpoon gun, was Leroy. The human wasn't moving. His face was a terrifying shade of mottled purple, his eyes bloodshot, and a thin trail of red leaked from his nose. For a long, heart-stopping minute, Kalen thought the void jumper had finally met a limit he couldn't push past. Then, Leroy's chest heaved. The human didn't scream, he didn't cheer, he just leaned his head back against the monster's cold hide and took 3 long, shaky breaths. He reached into his vest pocket, pulled out a crumpled, half-eaten sandwich that had survived the vacuum, and looked at it with profound disappointment. "Ruined," Leroy wheezed, his voice sounding like 2 stones grinding together. Damn things always get dry in a vacuum. High Exarch Kalen struggled to sit up, his sleek white armor cracked and useless. He looked at his dead Shadow-Fangs, then at the human who had outlasted an elite strike team using nothing but a pair of lungs and a grudge. "You," Kalen managed, his voice trembling with a mix of hypoxia and absolute disbelief. "You stayed conscious 2 minutes without a suit. It is biologically impossible." Leroy wiped the blood from his nose with the back of a greasy hand. He stood up slowly, his knees popping like small caliber gunshots. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who was late for a shift he didn't want to work. "Impossible for you, maybe," Leroy said, checking the pneumatic seal on his harpoon gun. "But humans? We've been holding our breath since we were lungfish. You core welders treat air like a right. Out here, it's just another resource you gotta manage." He looked through the reinforced observation window, at the station's secondary security team finally cutting through the outer door. He turned back to Kalen, who was still staring at him as if he were a ghost. "Hey, Exarch," Leroy grunted, gesturing toward the dead monster. "Make sure you put in the report that I used my own harpoon. I want the requisition department to pay for the spike." Kalen just nodded dumbly, as the medical teams rushed in with high-tech scanners and life support pods. Leroy Jenkins just shouldered his empty gun, stepped over the invincible biological weapon he had killed with his bare hands and a breath of air, and walked toward the cafeteria. He had 10 minutes left on his break, and he was still hungry.